Hi, we continue in Genesis 27 today, after Esau has discovered that his brother Jacob has come in and gotten their father to give him the blessing that belongs to Esau as the firstborn. And as we've been looking at this section, Esau in the rabbinical Midrash is treated as an evil monster, and that's because the Midrash, written in the centuries of Roman oppression of Jews and the time of Constantine and beyond, becomes a symbol for Rome. And so the Midrash doesn't help us with the immediate story, but one of the things that comes up in this section here, starting in verse 36, as you can see on the left side of the screen, is the fact that we were told by the oracle from Yahweh at the very beginning that there are two nations in your womb. So although I've been reading this in terms of the characters Esau and Jacob, and that's certainly one of the levels, it's the most obvious level, the other level is the question of Israel and Edom. And we're not going to look at it in a lot of detail here, but as we continue through this, we'll see how the authors are dealing not just with the question of these characters in the story and the original generations of the patriarchs, but of much later times when Edom was a nation in competition with Israel in the land of Canaan. So a couple of things we've been going over in this whole unit, as you can see on the right side of the screen, the chiastic shape of the entire Jacob cycle, and we're near the end of this purple section here, parallel with the purple section on the other side. And as we've been looking at the shape of the Jacob story, we're nearing the end of this first part with Jacob and Esau. They will return on the other side, but right now we're preparing for Jacob to go to the old country after Rebekah and Isaac tell him to go back there to his uncle Laban and find a wife there. As we've been looking more closely at our immediate section, we've been seeing the chiastic shape of this whole unit from 2634 to 28:9, and now we're on this section here, right here. And one of the things I want to notice is how many times father comes up in this immediate section, but how few times son comes up, relatively speaking. We've seen son many times earlier, and we see son, son, son here with Isaac and Jacob, when Isaac thinks that Jacob is Esau. But now that Isaac knows it's Esau, we only hear my son one time in our section here. One of the other things we've been looking at here, and in relation to the questionable assumptions that I've been addressing throughout this unit, that many scholars make that once we look at them closely tend to fall apart as assumptions. And in our immediate situation, a few that are relevant. One is that the supposed rights of the firstborn, in this case the blessing, are divinely sanctioned, as opposed to the simply being one human being saying words to another human being that don't necessarily have any power. And that's also involved here in number 7, that the words Isaac conveyed to his sons as blessing of actual power. Another one is that Isaac is weak as a father and is being manipulated by Rebekah and Jacob. But as they've been noting throughout, and as I showed in the beginning, Isaac is actually a strong father and a strong man in many ways, and it's at least equally likely that Isaac and Rebekah are manipulating Jacob. And we'll see these other things as we look at the next video. But one of the things I want to highlight here is this rights of the firstborn. That one of the things we'll see in our passage here is that Esau becomes a character who evokes our empathy. He's been treated unjustly. And is Esau a bad character? The only things we know he's done is that he's his father's favorite, just as Jacob is the mother's favorite, that he's a hunter, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Eating animals is what we saw was allowed after the flood back in Genesis 9. He forsake his birthright, but perhaps the authors forsake the birthright as being absurd, that somebody born just seconds before the other has a right to something beyond equality as two sons. And then similarly with the blessing here. And we have no reason to think that Isaac thinks that Esau is bad simply because Jacob came in deceivably, as we see in the last verse we looked at in verse 35, and took the blessing. That certainly isn't Esau's fault. So as we look into this story, we have no particular reason as readers of Genesis, as opposed to the later Midrashic readers who read Esau, as I noted, as a stand-in for Rome, to think that Esau is anything other than somebody made in the image of God, and son of the patriarch Jacob and son of the patriarch Isaac and his wife Rebekah, and is entitled to Yahweh's blessing, if not to the paternal blessing, the blessing of Abraham that Isaac is not capable of conveying, because only Yahweh can convey that. And that leads to this thing that I showed last time about blessing from Yahweh apart from our current chapter, many examples from chapter 1 all the way through. And then the examples of humans offering blessing. And as I note for each of these, none of these have any actual power other than to convey the sense that the person who's offering the blessing has good feelings about the person who's receiving the blessing. So it may say something about their relationship, but it says nothing whatsoever about the future, and it says nothing whatsoever about Yahweh's will, because Isaac's will is not necessarily Yahweh's will. And that goes to the other questionable assumption that the oracle that we saw back in chapter 25 conveys Yahweh's will. To the extent that people read the oracle as saying Jacob will rule over Esau, therefore Jacob's entitled to the paternal blessing, notice how many assumptions are involved to reach that conclusion, such that when we get to the Esau scene here, we think, too bad, Esau, Yahweh has picked Jacob over you. But in fact, there's no evidence of that whatsoever. It's simply the parents have chosen one over the other, and it's equal. What the mother has chosen Jacob and the father has chosen Esau. So they're equal in that regard, other than the fact at the very beginning of our passage we heard that Esau's choosing Hittite women as wives, whether they're the Hittite women in general or the two particular wives that we looked at back on the verses at the end of chapter 26, have been bitter of spirit for both parents. So those are some of the elements we need to be paying attention to, and I'll put the keywords up here for our immediate section as we begin to go through our verses here from 36 to 41 and finish our section here. So as my note below says, anticipating what Esau says here, a clever wordplay for a man of physical action. So Esau said, and I note below that Esau is not in the Hebrew, it simply says, and he said, is he not rightly named Jacob? Literally in the Hebrew, isn't he called the name Jacob? But it's Yaakov. And as Adrian Bledstein has noted, following the same interpretation that I've been encouraging here, along with the standard one, that the conspiracy is of the parents to trick Jacob, she throughout names the characters by what their name means. So this is hairy man saying that heel sneak in her language has supplanted. And that comes out in what we see in the Hebrew of these next verses. For he supplanted me these two times. But it's two consecutive words, Yaakov via ekveni here. And as Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg metaphorically interprets it, Esau sees him as the snake from the Garden of Eden, that is, 3:15, who comes up from behind and attacks the heel. Of course, Esau doesn't know anything about the Garden of Eden story, but Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg does. And this image is only referenced twice other, or the word rather, is only twice other in the Hebrew Bible, once in Jeremiah and once in Hosea. The Hosea one, as I can look at briefly here, explicitly recalls this scene. In the womb he tried to supplant his brother, and his manhood he strove with God, and then we see the angel, etc. And so that's at least some evidence. There's some sense of a Jacob story back in the 8th century when scholars understand Hosea was writing. And yet I've been arguing throughout, as most scholars do, that the book of Genesis is an exilic or post-exilic text. So there must have been some early tradition, but I'm not going to try to parse that as people like Mark Brett do, to try to take apart the various sources. I'm just going to read it as we've been doing, as we now have it in its final form. So there's another word play about feet here, and it's the New RSV has two times because that makes sense in English, but the euphemism in Hebrew is feet. Famayim here, and as the Brown Driver Griggs lexicon notes, a common figure of speech for twice. So here it's a bitter joke on the heel, who in a sense feeded Esau. So even though he's a heel sneak here, and then it's his feet that he's done, and of course he came out holding onto his brother's foot. So he says, he took away my birthright, but that isn't what happened. My note below has lakak, which is to take, perhaps a double entendre, because it can also mean to purchase. But in fact, that's what happened. So it could be he purchased my birthright, and it was an open deal. He didn't steal it. He didn't get it by deception. Esau gave it to him in exchange for the bowl of lentils. It was an open deal. There was no pressure. Esau didn't need that bowl of lentils. He could have found food elsewhere. He wasn't starving to death. So he, in fact, openly entered into the quote-unquote despising of his birthright, or as we noted at the time, the rejection of it from a legal standpoint, not necessarily from an emotional standpoint. In other words, he found it to be worthless, and yet here he recalls it as an element of the character of Jacob. It's not so much that Esau wants the birthright, it's that he sees his brother as a sneak. And that's the wordplay here in this verse between birthright and blessing as Bekoratai and Berakah here. And look, Vahana here, the word never translated as behold in the RSV, at least it has look here. He has taken away my blessing. And certainly he has taken away the blessing, even though he didn't necessarily take away the birthright. Maybe there's a play on the double meaning there as purchase here and as taken here. But then we get to the poignant part. So far, Esau has simply summarized the truth of the matter. But then we hear something that ought to generate empathy in anybody who's got anything but the hardest heart for Esau, based not on the text but on presuppositions. Then he said, have you not reserved a blessing for me? It can also mean take away. Playing on the taking away here, although it's only in a couple of places in the Hebrew Scripture, so we can't really parse the nuances of it that way. But he's certainly asking one way or another, why only one paternal blessing? And indeed we have to ask, and perhaps the text is asking, why only one paternal blessing? Ironically, at the end of the book of Genesis, in the Joseph cycle, Jacob will offer blessings to each of his 12 sons. In fact, 11 sons and 2 grandsons, Joseph's sons. And there's no question there that he can't bless all of them. They're not all positive blessings, but he certainly offers something for all of them. So by the time we get to the Joseph story, perhaps written a couple centuries later, that even the memory of the idea there's only one blessing for the firstborn son has seemed to have disappeared out of the text. But here's what we see Isaac answer. And my note below has to compare the actual wording that we saw compared with this summary to Esau, and I'll note that as we go rather than put them side by side. So Isaac answered Esau, and here and in 39 answered as opposed to blessed, which is what he did to Jacob as Esau. I have already made him your Lord. And as my note below has, it is the Father's, not Yahweh's blessing, but echoing the oracle. And from the verse, it would appear that Isaac believes his words cause the outcome. But does he really believe it? Or is this for Esau, as we'll see that Hoover suggests when we look at one of his notes in just a moment? And we can consider that as readers right now before we get to the scholarly comment. If Isaac is in on this with Rebekah, what is his purpose of saying this to Esau? Perhaps it's simply to get the blame off Isaac and more on Jacob, which was the plan all along. Not so much that the parents thought that Jacob getting the blessing meant that he was blessed, but that Jacob getting the blessing would mean that Esau would be angry and would want to kill him, as we'll see at the end of our section today he does, and that'll be the pressure to get Jacob to leave on his own and go back to meet Laban, Rebekah's brother, to find a wife back in the old country. So Isaac says, I have already made him your Lord, and have given him all his brothers as servants, literally slaves, and with grain and wine I have sustained him. But has he done any of those things? He has pronounced the wish that happens, but does Isaac have the power to make Jacob Lord over Esau? No, he does not, and in fact it never happens. And what does this mean, all his brothers as servants? What brothers? They're the only 2 brothers. And some scholars see the brothers here as meaning kin in the wide stretch, and it can certainly mean that. But perhaps here we're to read this as Israel and Edom and not just Esau and Jacob, because Israel will be the ruler over Edom for a while, but as we'll see in a minute, Isaac will say the time will come when Esau will be liberated from Jacob, and that also fits Israel and Edom, but does not fit Jacob and Esau, as we see in the later part of the story where they're reunited and Esau has plenty and is not mad anymore, and all is well between the brothers, at least from Esau's perspective. And so he says he's given him grain and wine. He actually didn't say that. He said, may the earth provide for you. It's not like he's buying this from the merchants and giving it to him. He's suggesting that he's going to be agricultural, but that's not pointed out here. Isaac, as we saw earlier in chapter 26, is the only one of the patriarchs to be said to be a farmer. And I have sustained him here is a word only here, semekte here in Genesis. It's in Exodus and 48 times in Hebrew Scripture, as my notes repeats what I just said. So what then can I do for you, my son? And as my note below has, that's for the audience, I think, a question of the legitimacy of the blessing and birthright that generates this gross injustice that we can see here. So is Isaac asking a rhetorical question within the plot narrative, but for we as readers, perhaps it's the real question of the authors here. What can the father do for the second son? The word then here is, as we heard in verse 33, it's only uttered at one time. And my son here, and I won't look back at my note at 27:1, just highlighting how many my sons are, and we saw them, as I noted earlier, so many of them up here and around. But it's especially poignant here where Isaac affirms that Esau is the favored son, but has been irreversibly deprived of the blessing of the firstborn. The term "my son" was used 6 times in the conversation between Isaac and Jacob when Isaac thought it was Esau. So let's scroll down here so we can see the rest of our passage for today. And we really can hear Esau's cry of the oppressed here. And throughout the Hebrew Bible, it's the cries of the oppressed that go to Yahweh, like the Israelites crying out at the end of Exodus 2, or the citizens of Sodom crying out in Genesis 18. So here's Esau, one of the oppressed by something that's not oppressed by Yahweh. He's oppressed by a cultural form that, again, I'm suggesting this text is challenging. So notice 3 times father in the verse. Esau said to his father, as if we didn't know who he was talking to, "Have you only one blessing, father?" Westerman, reading this half a century ago, says it sounds quite naive and clumsy. It only makes sense in the context of the whole narrative. But of course, that's true of everything. It only makes sense in the context of the whole narrative. That's how scholarship has shifted since the time of Westerman. "Bless me, me also, father." And notice what's at issue in this verse is Esau and his father. Father 3 times, me, and then finally, when there's no response, Esau lifted up his voice and wept. The Septuagint inserts dramatically, Isaac was silent. And we won't look at the Leviticus 3 note right down there. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. And there's a wonderful or terrible irony, depending on your perspective, which is that's Jacob's response to Rachel once he gets back to the old country and he falls in love with her and he kisses her and he lifts up his voice and weeps. So both brothers will lift up their voice and weep. Esau in sadness and a sense of injustice at losing the paternal blessing, and Jacob in joy at meeting one of his wives, although he doesn't know that at the time. So Isaac's not done yet here. Then his father answered him, and as my note below from Westerman has, the effectiveness of the father's blessing must be more than what custom and right have made it. The narrator is saying just this when, despite the father's protestations that he has no more blessings, he has him nevertheless dispense yet another. And yet, I would disagree with Westerman because he doesn't use the word bless, and it's not a blessing. It's a negative statement, since the meaning of blessing in the Hebrew Bible, and particularly in Genesis, means fertility and material prosperity from the earth, not money and big things like that, but the prosperity that comes from living things, which means the fruit of the land and the fruit of the womb. This is plainly what he's saying you're not going to have. And it turns out not to be true. We don't know later how Esau gets his wealth, but he has plenty, and so he has not been deprived in the end. In other words, what's oppressive here is just the words of the father, which have no effect whatsoever on Esau's actual life, other than to alienate him from his father and from his brother. See another Gehenna behold here, away from the fatness, and yet there's an ambiguity here of the Hebrew preposition min, which can be translated as one version as of the fatness, or the of the fatness or away from the fatness, as here. The King James also has of the fatness. As Hoover notes, without getting into the technical grammatical details, he suggests it's deliberately ambiguous, and I would agree that we could read it either way. That this word has that ambiguity. And we note here in the comparison that this is what we saw in his blessing to Jacob. May God give you the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth. And now he's told you will be away from, or maybe not, the fatness of the earth, and away from the dew of heaven. And it's the same word in both places. So it could be more parallel than it appears to be, and this is the positive one, this is the negative one in the translation. Let's continue back with our verse and look at more of the details. Shall your home be, literally your dwelling place, and it's only a couple of other places, but in 36:43, and we'll look at it there, it clearly refers to the Edom situation. So we don't need to look at the details here, but we hear this is the end of the genealogy of Esau, the clans of Edom, that is Esau, here the father of Edom. Other times it simply says Esau is Edom. So that will be about the Edomites, and that's suggesting that's what's referring to here, not just about Esau. And that would mean the brothers as well. It would be all of the Israelites, not just literally Jacob or Esau's non-brothers. The little word for on high here, Me'el, is also in Jacob's blessing of his children, and that may be exactly there for the purpose of getting us to listen to them both together, as I was noting, where Jacob blesses all his sons. And then he continues on with an interesting piece that certainly applies, as Westermann notes below, to the application to the history of the peoples of Israel and Edom. By your sword you shall live. We've seen that Esau was living by his bow and arrow, not by a sword. We don't know anything about him having a sword, and yet, again, that's about Edom later. We'll see that we saw the sword, with the sword that the cherubim bear outside the Garden of Eden. We'll see the sword in 34:25, which is not quite the chiastic parallel, but on the other side of the story, where they use the sword against the Shechemites, and then we'll see it again where Jacob references a sword, but we'll look at that there. So by your sword you shall live. Westermann notes that Esau doesn't have a hard life, but he is to live. But in fact, he does not have a hard life. This is just an example of the scholars starting with those questionable assumptions and then interpreting the story through that. And I hope that illustrates the point that you as listeners and as interpreters yourselves, whether I point them out or you look at them yourselves, to consider when you interpret texts, to not start from presuppositions that really don't have a basis in the text. Just because scholars say so doesn't make it so. And just because I say so doesn't make it so. Throughout these videos, I'm not suggesting I'm the authority either, but the text is the authority, and we're just walking through it together. So by your sword you shall live, and you shall literally slave for your brother, which again doesn't happen, but it does with Edom serving under Israel. But when you break loose, and this is certainly having to do with Edom and Esau, and not with Edom and Israel, not Jacob and Esau. When you break loose, word only here in the Hebrew Scriptures, so it's hard to get an exact meaning, but this is what most translations have, something like that. You shall break his yoke from your neck. It's only here in Genesis. Yoke is not a theme that we'd see so much in Genesis, whether a literal yoke of oxen or yoke as we see in passages like Isaiah 58 and others, where it's the very burden of slavery or work oppression that's put on people, so they're being treated like farm animals, like oxen, from your neck. And this recalls verse 16, Jacob with Esau on his neck, which is to say the hairy part of the goat, not literally Esau on his neck. And that will be Jacob who was around Esau's neck, where Esau was symbolically around Jacob's neck earlier. So we reach the end of our scene here with listening into Esau's mind. And as my note below has, it threatens to repeat the Cain-Abel pattern. It won't, but we see it here for similar reasons, although in Cain and Abel, it was Yahweh who refused to accept Cain's offering. So there, at least Cain was justified, that there was something literally from the God who made them that seemed arbitrary to Cain, and Cain rebelled. But here Esau is parallel, based not on something that is permanent and real like God, but as something that's ephemeral and meaningless from the Father. So as a result, Esau hated Jacob, or literally could be bore a grudge. And again, we'll see it way later in Jacob's blessings in those last couple of chapters. So a number of connections between this scene and the closing scenes of the book. So Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. Notice the repetition emphasized that. And Esau said to himself, or literally said to his heart, Sarna, to defend the narrator against the charge of omniscience, of being able to get into Esau's head, notes, it simply means that his mind was made up, not that he kept his thoughts to himself, but it could be read either way. The days of mourning for my father are approaching. But are they? No, they're not at all. As we saw earlier, one of the false assumptions in the story from the characters, not just from interpreters, but sometimes it's from interpreters, I looked at in the beginning, is that Isaac is on his deathbed. And much of the art I've been showing throughout this section shows Isaac on his deathbed. The art for this one does not, from the Florentine doors. But he's not on his deathbed. As you can see here, he's just was 100 years old when Esau took his wives, and so that's what he is now. And they'll bury him at 180, 80 years from now. So he's 80 years from his deathbed. He's not anywhere close to that. And that's just from the text. That's not a matter of interpretation. That's just from the text itself. So he's wrong. Esau's wrong in thinking that his father is about to die. But he says, the days of mourning are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob, as Hoover notes, following the path of Cain. And yet that won't happen when they come together. It will be shalom. It will be peace. So we'll continue with what I suggest the story is really about here at the end, which is Rebekah preparing Jacob, already having prepared him in part way, to head back to the old country on his own to deal with the ultimate trickster Laban. See you next time for that.